We are now at what to me is the really fun part of the evening. Fun in a deep sense. These are obviously very serious stories. And yet this is the part where we try to get under the hood of this year's extraordinary DART Award winners and really talk as journalists about how this work gets done. So to do that, I'm going to move from here to there. And then for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll have a conversation. And again, there'll be plenty of time for questions from the floor, and I would encourage you to really think about that. Our job tonight, now that you've gotten your awards and had your champagne, is to provide some reflection space for you, but also maybe some lessons for future journalists. This will be videoed, goes up on the site, and people really do draw from the work that you do, and this is deeply embedded in the DART Awards, some sense of how to do it, some sense of how it's done. You've all done things that haven't exactly been done before in one way or another. You're all innovators. And these are stories that involved enormous challenges, challenges of time, challenges of ethics, challenges of storytelling and research. So we want to talk about that. I'm going to ask each of you, each team or individual, to maybe talk for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, a little bit about where these stories came from, key challenges you faced along the way. You can add to whatever you said in the thank yous on that. And then sort of takeaways, what you brought away. And I think, Jackie and Leila and Tom, let's start with you. This was, a year in the life of the most profoundly wounded family. You entered his life. I remember at a much earlier DART Award, the one in 1995, talking to this severely burned individual, Mr. Emmett Jackson, who had allowed a reporter in for his recovery, and I said, why did you trust this woman? And he said, oh no, it was just how she walked into the room. How did this story begin for you guys, and how did it end up where it went?
Well, I was the morning breaking news reporter, so I worked from 6:30 a.m. to 3:30-ish, and it was a Monday morning, and Christopher, the 9-year-old, had walked to his school, which is about 2 or 3 blocks away, to report the killings. And so we got very initial information from Las Vegas Metro Police and obviously went to the scene. And we knew it was something bigger and more complicated because they weren't coming to tell us anything anytime soon. And it was also one of the first nice spring days of the year. And so I was out there at the scene for a long time, and the police eventually kind of reneged on the initial information they told us, which was that a boy had gone to school and reported the death of 2 people in his house. And I think they did so because there was so much confusion as to who Arturo was, and initially they suspected that maybe he played a role in it because he couldn't articulate himself. And so that was our first encounter. By the end of the first day, we basically had a simple story saying that a boy had walked to his school and an adult and a child had died. And so as the days progressed, we obviously learned more, and the police ruled Arturo out as a suspect. And then I think it was 10 or 14 days later, they made an arrest. And so this was ongoing. It was getting a lot of attention. And, everyone wanted to know who did this. And thanks to good police work and putting all the pieces together, they tied it to attempted sexual assault a couple blocks away that happened before the suspect, I guess, presumably walked and chose the Martinez house to break into. And so that's how it initially came out. Did the breaking story. I think a coworker covered the arrest, but it was something I think that bothered the community as a whole. There's lots of crime in Las Vegas, but this one seemed to strike a chord and touch people. And so I covered the funeral, which was difficult because it was all in Spanish. So it was a very short take on it. And through the process, I had started speaking to Arturo's sister, Gaudia, who is basically has the warmest personality of anyone you'd ever meet. And at the same time, their family friend happened to be from Cleveland, and I'm from Cleveland, and realized a connection and had said he thought our coverage was accurate in the beginning, and that if I wanted to speak with the family more later on, that he would essentially put in a good word. And so that's what happened. I think it was the end of May. I was working on a Sunday, and they were having a fundraiser at a boxing gym for Arturo and his boys. And so I went just to meet them in person once more, and that was the first time I met Arturo face to face. And I'll always remember it because it told me a lot about his character in that initial meeting. I walked up and introduced who I was, but because of his traumatic brain injury and other injuries, couldn't really speak at all at that point. But even though I was a stranger meeting him for the first time, he took my hand and held it in his and just, smiled. And so that was how we started. And I think it was by the end of June, July, we were following the family more closely. And we knew initially we wanted to do something more meaningful. We didn't really quite know what it was or what it would turn into be. But as we started getting to know the family a little bit more, we realized that it was a longer take, that we needed to spend as much time as we could with this family. And I thought it was important that we sat down and explained our intentions to the family. And because of Arturo's traumatic brain injury, I didn't want it just to be him, because I wanted to make sure he understood everything that we were hoping to do, which was to be a fly on the wall in their lives for the next 6 or months or a year. It turned into a year almost. And so we met in his boxing gym with Arturo, his sister, his brother-in-law, and then a family friend, and just kind of laid out what I hoped to do and what Leila hoped to do, that we wanted to be there. We didn't want to cause him any more harm or grief, and that we wanted him to be honest with us if there was anything he didn't want us to be there for. And he agreed to let us enter his lives. So that's how it progressed. And from there, we had followed him through physical therapy, the boys' first day back at school, his brain surgery, court hearings, holidays, etc.
And Leila, what kind of choices did you face as a photographer? Are you dealing with severe injury? You're dealing with criminal activity, privacy? I mean, there's so much. What were your choices?
Well, I met Arturo a little bit later than Jackie did at a press conference that he held in, I want to say July. It was in July. And, we met him right before the press conference, actually. And he was very distrustful of the media at that time because some media had reported right after the incident that he was the killer or he was the suspect. So he did not trust the media, and I think we really had to work slowly. I think our approach had to be slow, and like Jackie said, we sat down, we talked to him, we told him what we were going to do, what we wanted to do, and I think in that way, that was the way we kind of went about it, and I think we slowly gained his trust that way.
And Tom, you're sitting there as the editor on this, and on the one hand, as a former editor myself, I can look at this story that's coming in and see, wow, this is going to be really cool. But I also might see it as full of minefields, things to worry about. What was on your mind as this story was coming together?
It helped that I had total confidence in both Jackie and Leila. This is Jackie's first full-time newspaper job, right? She had interned. She interned with us, and I remember at one point she was covering Cop Shop. And, Tom, can I please get off the Cop Shop? I'm just tied to this damn phone, and I want to do some longer stories. And so we started letting her break out, but it was the kind of the pitiful but justified concerns of a reporter wanting to do much more than just write 4-paragraph briefs. And every time we gave her a story to do, she performed it wonderfully. And the Sun always likes to have sort of one project going at a time. We can't afford more than one. But we thought this was certainly an important story to follow if, as Jackie was sharing with us, she could win the family's confidence. And once she said yes, we were able to spend time with them. it was easy just to give her carte blanche to call her shots. And so I would like to take a whole lot of pride as the editor for running this thing, but I just stayed out of the way. They are very mature journalists, and they understood the times, when to step in, how to be a fly on the wall. And I hate to say that there weren't too many risks on my part, but there weren't, because with every outing, they would brief me, and I said, that's wonderful. God bless the family, and thank you for doing good work. And they would make their own decisions when to go out and meet the family, whether it's cemetery or the boxing gym or the family home or a friend's house or Halloween or Thanksgiving or Christmas. And they spent a lot of time, and they had carte blanche to do what they thought was necessary. And giving them that wide rein meant that she was working a lot of overtime I wasn't paying for because it was her choice. So she really invested. I'm sorry. She didn't ask for permission, and I didn't give any, but that's okay. But she worked very, very hard, both Leila and Jackie, and the rewards were the package. So actually, it was pretty risk-free for me.
But there must have been, for any of you, must have been some really hard moments where you had to ask, am I here for the right reasons, or what do I do now, or is it right to print this? What were a few of those? What were the dilemmas that you faced along
Well, the first one, and it was Jackie's decision, essentially was not to bring the children back into the story. It was an easy, early-on decision that Jackie recommended, and nobody would have disagreed with that.
It also helped that Christopher had testified before the grand jury, and I had access to that transcript. And, once you read, I think it was 24 pages or something, he talked in such specific detail that I didn't need anything more. And then once you read that, there's no way, ethically that I would have felt good asking him to relive all those same questions. And so we were able to mesh, for that first story, which was, the attack itself, mesh Arturo's memories with the grand jury transcripts.
Any other particular dilemmas, arguments, questions, soul-searching?
Well, there were definitely times where I had, as a photographer, there were moments where, I was there taking photographs and just felt like I had to put my camera down and just stop taking photographs.
What kinds of moments?
There was one that definitely comes to mind is when it was the Christmas Eve dinner, when the family is, around the table in prayer. And they did this long prayer, and they said what they were thankful for. And then afterwards, everyone was hugging, and I could see Arturo just getting really emotional and tears were starting to well up. And so I was photographing that, but then he just kind of quietly left the room and went into the bedroom. And part of me was like, I should follow him in there and take more pictures of him, because this is an emotional moment and it's very telling, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't follow him in there. So that was definitely a trying situation for me as a photojournalist.
And one last thing, and then we'll maybe move on to Alexis, but what were you most proud of in either the process or the product? Any of you? Or maybe each of you, actually.
You want to go first?
I think that I don't, at least, from what they've told us, I don't think we caused the family any more harm. Actually, Arturo, I don't think has read the whole thing, but his sister has, and lots of their other family and friends, and it was warmly received. And we didn't have any, issues. And because I remember the day it ran, Leila and I were very worried, and my stomach was in knots the entire day until I heard from someone connected to the family. And so I guess that's what I'm most proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I think what I'm most proud of is in the video that we were able to kind of have Arturo narrate it in his own words, which were the words that he wrote for a press conference that he gave, in which he forgave the killer. So those were the words that he was reading in the video, and I'm really happy that we were able to incorporate that and kind of. So he was kind of a collaborator in that with us.
I'm not sure if this is a moment of pride, but I want to go back to the challenge. I should have mentioned this. When you start a project, anybody who's done a long project knows this going in, you don't know how it's going to turn out, because you're committing to a year-long effort or whatever it's going to be, and you don't know what crossroads you might face. Sarah mentioned earlier about I wrote it down, the pure victim, the notion that a victim is always pure and sympathetic. And in the reporting, we learned a couple of things, or a couple of developments that made Arturo kind of less than pure by some measure. One was that he had entered the country illegally. He was an illegal immigrant. And we wondered for a moment, how do we deal with that? Well, we dealt with it honestly, with transparency. And in fact, he talked about sneaking into the country several times before he finally made it and then brought his wife over separately. So that was out there in the open, and we kind of gritted our teeth, but it worked out okay. There wasn't any blowback on that. The other element that was sort of a curveball was that Arturo, towards the end of your being with him, fell in love again and became engaged and got married. And people might think, well, what are you doing? You're grieving. Well, he's moving on, and that's maybe a testament. He's giving witness to moving on in recovery, was he allowed himself to marry again. But initially, my knee-jerk reaction was, in terms of a smell test, oh, I wish he hadn't gotten married again. But something about the pointers here.
The editors in the
ethics.
room are laughing especially hard.
Because I have editor vision, right? I want to be perfect, and that was a curveball. But no, we dealt with it all, honestly.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks. Alexis, you know, for your story for More Magazine, you had this, when I read it, I thought this is doing something really remarkable, taking a subject that at this point we think we all know in the context of a popular magazine, intimate partner violence, and forcing us to look at it in a different way. How did the story happen? How did you make it work? Where did it lead you?
Okay, well, I have to throw this one to my editor. The first part of how the story happened, Jennifer Braunschweiger, who I've worked with for 10 years, and it's really because of her that this story came about. So if you just say a few words.
Sure, Jennifer, grab this. Where's the Q&A mic? It's over there. Why don't you?
I didn't work with her for 10 years on this story, though.
Felt like it. This story actually came out of a conversation that we were having with the Verizon Foundation. And they have a professional interest or a philanthropic interest in issues surrounding domestic violence. And they came into the magazine. They have a charismatic leader named Rose Kirk, and she came into the magazine to talk to us about what they were pursuing. And I have been a health editor in previous jobs, and they just kind of dropped in that they had heard out there about this connection between domestic violence and chronic illness, and this was complete news to me. And after the meeting, I went running down the hallway after our editor-in-chief, because I am that girl, and I said, I want this story, and I want Alexis to write it, because part of the magic that happens for a story is when, or for an editor, is when you find the right writer to work on the piece that you know is there. So I will also say that we all know that journalism is very expensive, and the Verizon Foundation allowed us to pursue a more expensive story than we would have otherwise. We have had corporate partnerships before, so we spelled out exactly what they were and were not allowed to do. Basically, they were not allowed to do anything except pay for it. And that was all discussed up front before anything else happened. But they funded a national study. We went out to 1,000 women across the country, and we asked about their experiences with chronic illness and with domestic violence, and it allowed us to put hard numbers and original research on a topic. And then, of course, Alexis, who has such a wonderful way with women, and I knew through long experience was able to really get to the emotion as well as understand the science, brought it to life. But the genesis was really with the Verizon Foundation.
Thanks. So
Thanks,
Alexis,
Jennifer.
you know, science is one thing, journalism another. How'd you do it?
Okay, the essence of this story is that everyone knew a piece of it, and no one knew all of it. And even at the end of reporting the story, I didn't know all of it. But there was this, so the women themselves knew that they had these problems that they couldn't understand. The epidemiologists knew that there were these very weird numbers coming out about women getting things you'd understand, PTSD, but things you wouldn't necessarily understand, like arthritis or higher cancer rates or gastrointestinal illness. You had activists sort of seeing it and sort of not. In some ways, they were too close. And then you had the brain scientists who didn't know the women, didn't know a lot of the details, but they understood the biology of stress. And then, so then there was me, who, you know, as Bill Moyer said, you know, a free press is where you can connect the dots and come to a conclusion. And so I did what I always do, which is two things. I talked to 1 million people, all the different organizations I could find, and I was asking them for women, and of course this brings up what Sarah was talking about the perfect victim, and you talk about it. You know, because the thing is, I had to find women who'd gone through very, very serious, brutal domestic violence, had left it 10, 20, even 30 years later, and had not resorted to smoking, drinking, or any kind of substance abuse after having been horribly, horribly hurt. Because any reason to say, oh, well, you got that because of this, would dismiss them as cases, right? So I had to find people who were angels and who had led very, very difficult lives and were willing to talk to me, because that was the easy part. Then I had to do what I always do, which is to pretend to be a lot smarter than I am, and talk to brain scientists and epidemiologists, and some of whom did not have government clearance to talk to me. So there was the woman who had done the Centers for Disease Control study, and she was leaving the country in like 10 minutes. And so she talked to me off the record and gave me an absolutely fabulous interview, the kind you get when someone is talking to you off the record. And she said the best quotes ever. And then she proceeded to leave the country for 3 months. You know, we are, you know, a magazine with some time constraints, although anything that I write, they get a little looser. I did not have as much time as you guys had, but I had a few months to work on this. Although ultimately, I think I did it in 6 weeks, which is kind of a record for me. Would you say?
This was a quick one for you.
Yeah. So what I had to do was talk to all these people who were brilliant, and the way I describe this is, if you try to get in the river and like swim in the rivers of their thought, you're never going to get it. So I figured the conceptual boulders, and I just jumped from one to another until I figured I can explain things. So I had the government studies, I had the epidemiologists, so anyway, how did I do it? I put it all together, but the key thing always was telling a story. And I was very lucky in finding women, not only who would talk to me and whose stories magically shed light on each of the sort of disease groups, but I actually had a woman who I started with and ended with who kind of had a happy ending. And I just thought that was really important for the story, was just to not be completely hammered by it, that you could live through this experience and come out at the other end. And she managed to have a baby at the end. I mean, it's kind of a classic American happy ending story, but the part of it that was most remarkable for me, and Jennifer and I have talked about this, is that some of the women I talked about have devoted their lives to domestic violence activism, trying to understand it better, trying to bring it to the fore. And one woman I interviewed has written a book about it. Her name is Leslie Morgensteiner. Okay, she's done a TED Talk on it. I mean, she's spent 15 or 20 years working on this. She's sort of the public face of this thing. But she said that until I called her, she had never actually made the connection in her own life between the chronic illness she has and what had happened to her probably 30 years earlier, 20, 30 years earlier. So even people who make this their life work, these were connections that hadn't been made. So that felt, and then of course the emails and letters I think I mentioned earlier, with people finally making that connection. And even if it doesn't cure them, it doesn't. To be able to connect the dots in their own life was hugely important to
And
people.
talk just a little bit, we may come back to this, about the impact of the story beyond the letters and emails.
Well, I know this from Jennifer because she went down to D.C. There was a Verizon Help Fund. And by the way, I want to say, you can take, I was very suspicious. I'm not dealing with a corporation, da, 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 da. But,
my job, the dirty work.
There's really no difference, though, in dealing with ProPublica or, the Center for Public Integrity. Maybe there is a difference, but the idea that serious investigative reporting has to be paid for by someone, and certainly it's a lot cleaner to think about these nonprofits doing it. I was like, you deal at Verizon. But in fact, the woman, and am I allowed to say this? The woman who's the president of the Verizon Foundation had had a personal experience in her own family with domestic violence, right? So she came at it in a way that I respected, and it didn't feel like they were just trying to promote themselves. I never actually felt that. But anyway, they financed a big summit on this topic in D.C. in Congress. And Capitol Hill. There's one little nugget that I actually really, really savor, which is that he read it on a plane and crossed out several lines of his speech so that he could quote from the story instead. So
Very nice.
that felt great.
Well, thank you. Ben, these two stories had at least something like happy endings. Your work involved a different kind of an embed in a place where there's some light and also a fair amount of darkness. You're certainly not the first person or the first team to sort of do immersion reporting in a public high school. You can go all the way back to Jonathan Kozol, Death at an Early Age, and other things. And yet this story is different. What inspired it, and how did you approach it so that it would be a different kind of story?
Well, we had originally heard about this story through Linda Lutton, one of the reporters on the shows. She did a story about Principal Sanders, who's the principal of Harper High School. And it was just, she'd heard through working her beat that there had been a principal who had a school where, at that point, 28 students, recent or current, had been shot and 8 had been killed. And she just said, I'm just going to go do a story about this principal because it just floored her. Like, she thought those numbers had to be wrong. So that's how we found out about it, through her initial story. And in terms of how we approached it, I feel like the biggest challenge that we faced was the weight of the assumptions that I feel like the way these issues are usually or often covered in.
So what are some of those assumptions that you might identify in yourself or in your listeners?
I think for one, people's our understanding, just even as reporters who covered Chicago and knew this type of violence, the assumptions about the structure of the street gangs, that you've got sort of big blocks and everybody's selling drugs. That's sort of the name of the game, and they identify themselves in these prominent ways. That wasn't true at all, and it was much more socially driven. Sort of those assumptions were old and outdated, and once we were there, the implications of that were so nuanced. I think we all found it, like, just one moment that I'll tell you about. When we were first there, I was standing outside a school with a security guard and a police officer who's stationed at the high school, and they just say, "Where's so and so?" And they look down the street, and he says, "Oh, he just left a minute ago." And somebody said, "Oh, well, I saw his boys leave, 2 or 3 minutes ago. He better catch up with them." And so essentially you had the security guard and the police officer who are working against, these cliques of different gangs, all these subsects in the neighborhood, wanting this kid to catch up with the group from his block that he would more tightly be associated with, from that, if he walked to school with them for protection on a daily basis, but wanting him to walk with them because they knew that would be safer. And that was the desire of the security guard and the police officer. And so I feel like the challenge for us, and sort of what we went in with, was seeing it as, like, what quickly became apparent was we felt like that was our challenge, to to get at sort of the nuance and complexities that went against assumptions you might have about gang structure, or from sort of the tone with which these incidents are usually covered in the press. You know, I feel like you hear a Metro brief and there's a lot of sub-stories that people instantaneously write about, you know, gang-related shooting, 16 years old, oh, well, that kid must have made some bad choices. You know, you make assumptions about the home that the kid came from, and it was, you know, that was, I feel like, defied by the majority of the realities that we confronted.
But it's one thing to think about that as a social scientist, to say there are patterns and the patterns aren't what the public understands, blah, blah, blah. As a journalist, how did you make that vivid to your listeners? What were the most important storytelling choices you think you guys, either you individually or you and Linda and Alex and the rest of the team, made?
It's hard to narrow it down, because I feel like the 2 hours are such a composite.
Well, maybe think about a day in which you're embedded in the school, any day. What are some of the decisions that you face? How do you get trust with the kids? What do you cover and not cover? What do you go back and as a keeper for the story? Walk us through that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I can just speak to how we worked,
Yeah.
which was, I'm based out here, so I made half a dozen trips out there. Alex and Linda are both in Chicago, so they could spend a lot more time at the school. But in general, you know, we were spending whole days there, extensive periods of time in the neighborhood around the school, in the high school, and we were also collectively keeping at a lot of points our story lists. We had the stories that we were drawn to, the stories that we felt were sort of mandated by the realities that we were finding. For example, we knew we wanted to tell the story of one particular murder in depth. We knew that, later on it became apparent that we were going to need a story that broke down sort of the new infrastructure of the gangs. And then I feel like, in a way that so many people in this room are familiar with, it, you just had, in terms of the human fabric of the 2 hours, there were the people and the stories that you were just drawn to, combined with the people who would let you in.
There's also this interesting piece, and then maybe we'll move to questions from the room, if there's a microphone somewhere. How do you make this tolerable, in a way, to listeners? And this is something that all of you have dealt with one way or another. But you're talking about often some very, very difficult events. There's that little clip we played, which is so full of grief and pain. How do you balance that stuff with the kind of structure that says, once upon a time, here's a story, I want to listen to it? How did you structure it so that people would actually listen to this?
I feel like the biggest win that we had at our back in that respect was the school staff. Was the principal and the access that she granted us. And I think the access that she granted us came from, I was just saying this to Jack, I think that her confidence in her staff and the efforts that they were making, the job that they were doing. I think that in this sort of school, that's another assumption, is that there would be a certain amount of incompetence. But this Harper flies, I think, in the face of that you have a lot of confident people working as hard as they can. And I feel like that effort, combined by sort of the natural resilience of high school kids, I feel like that within all of it, it added a component of hope that I feel like helped, like in terms of formulating the hours in the way that you're talking about. I feel like that was a force for that type of storytelling.
Okay. Questions from the room? There's a mic there, and say who you are for purposes of the video record, and anything else, remember that this is being recorded, so don't embarrass your grandmother.
Ben Montgomery. Ben, I think what stood out to me about the Harper High pieces was there were like a lot of poofs of levity, and I can't recall a specific example, but there's like funny moments in that story. As a two-time DART judge, so many stories are so low, and they stay on this level of like, God, this is awful. Like, I hate humanity. That stood out about this story. Jackie, I think it stood out. There's a level of redemption and hope also in your stories. Were you looking for those things, and how did you find them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we were hoping that they would find happiness at the, just as human to human. But, the one moment that stands out to me is on Halloween, we decided to go with the family, and Arturo and his kids were meeting up with their old neighbors in their former home. And it was formerly a really close-knit neighborhood that was ruined by the foreclosure crisis. And so they were meeting back up, and it was just a really great opportunity for them to all hang out again. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, Halloween is an event that sort of glorifies horror and scary things, and these boys had been through, and Arturo himself had been through, like, the worst horror movie that's never been made. And so I wondered how they would deal with that, and it was remarkable because as they were trick-or-treating, they were catching up with their friends, and the boys were going from house to house. But at the very end, there was this guy, and I forget the movie, but from a horror movie, he was dressed up as someone from a horror movie, and he was trying to scare everyone, and he'd been following the group the entire time. And so finally, they basically just owned up to it and met him and feigned being frightened. And at the very end, as they were walking back, Arturo laughed this like full-bellied laugh. And it was the first time I think that we heard him really just break loose and laugh and smile. And so it was a good moment.
I mean, I think for us it sort of was a natural thing because just the everyday existence of Harper as a high school, and it's an environment where, I mean, 99% of what happened there was like high school life, and kids are making fun of each other, and security guards have funny relationships with different kids, and teachers are funny. It was just like, and that was the bulk of that place's existence. So I feel like, kind of just, all we had to do was bear witness to the, the great people who were there and pay attention to the personalities.
Yeah. Other thoughts, queries, arguments? Someone? Yeah, go. Yep. Go. This is my colleague Alana Newman, Research Director of the DART Center.
I have to introduce myself. Joe and I were just talking about both pieces, I think, talk about forgiveness or accountability, and are very both winners really have focused on this kind of issue very clearly. How do you move on? How do you forgive? How do you hold yourself accountable and take action but still not threaten yourselves? And I wondered how much discussion you all had in addressing those issues. It really struck us.
Any takers?
I could talk about it a little bit. Well, Arturo was the one who chose to forgive, and he was the one who, I mean, he had a press conference and read a forgiveness statement to the killer of his wife and daughter. How many months? Like 3 months after it happened. And I think that a lot of that came from his faith, his Catholic faith, and just having conversations with his priest and figuring out how to move on. That was the only way that he knew how to do it.
So he really drove that story.
Oh yeah, that was him. Yeah.
I'm trying to think in the hours, which threads are dealing with forgiveness and accountability.
Well, there's threads about accountability and how do you save face in your group and still go on. There's issues about how do you justify giving services and then taking them away, funding issues.
Oh,
I mean, I
yeah.
could go through a whole.
Yeah, I know.
Throughout, if there were these themes.
I mean, I think that maybe I'm struggling with it because it was one of the things that we had a hard time with. in that part of the issues of the violence in the neighborhood around the school involved just the lack of accountability. There's a thread in the second hour, I do the story of a kid, Terrence Green, who was shot and killed. And we really struggled with a component of it, which was that in contrast to a lot of these types of shootings, there were 2 eyewitnesses to that shooting, and they were both willing to tell the police who it was that had shot and killed him. It was well known. And I FOIA'd the police report from the killing, and they redacted all this stuff, but they did it in a way that where you can paste it into Word and then you can read the whole thing. So I read the whole thing, and the names were in there. There were 2 kids who knew this kid from the neighborhood. It was just it was known, and the a police officer who I talked to at some point told me, like, I just need to tell you, the detectives that worked on this were angry because the state's attorney's office wouldn't prosecute this, and they wouldn't prosecute it because they didn't want their conviction rate to go down, and they were concerned about the reliance on eyewitness testimony. And so the detectives were mad. So that had sparked a conversation among us about the nature, the nature in which this type of violence is accounted for and pursued. And I feel like we really struggled with the amount with which we were not able to include that in the 2 hours and still tell the stories that we wanted to remain intact.
Yeah, for this panel, and also a question that came to my mind for previous panels, how do you build trust and build this really intensive relationships, and at the same time you're not their friend and you're only there for a certain time, and you leave and you know they're part of their life, and then you're out of there and leave. So how do you deal with that? Gisela.
Any of you on that one. Alexis, what about you?
Well, I really feel like my story is different from these stories in so many ways, but also that the trauma was old.
Yeah.
Although there were newer traumas. There was the trauma of how this continued to affect them in their lives. And I also was dealing with people who were probably more in their 40s and 50s. So there's just a different set of circumstances, although I guess, I don't know how old the guy was, Arturo. I think how I built, well, there's the obvious way you build trust, which is that someone gave them my name or gave me their name, so I wasn't calling anybody cold. I talked to people in all the state organizations and some of the national organizations. So, and I asked some of those people to call them in advance to see if they would talk to me. So that's something all journalists do, right? You try to build that sort of network of trust, that you rely on the trust they have for the people who gave you their name, okay? But I guess what I did in all these cases was to say, I gave them, there's a little bit of a quid pro quo, right? I said, look, there's all this new research out there that I want to share with you. Can you tell me in what way your story may shed some light on this, or that maybe this research shed some light on your story? But what I always tell people is, tell me your story. The truth is, I do this story the way I do any story. I say, take me to the very beginning of your story. Take me to what happened before the beginning of your story. I want to understand the whole thing. Now, doing that with 24 people, when I can only choose 3 or 4, you feel like you're abusing people, because at some point someone says, oh, and then I smoked a pack a day, or I have diabetes in my family, or something like that. And I'd have to say, I'm really sorry. Your story is riveting and whatever, but I can't use it. But for everyone else, I would say, if you tell me the story in as much detail as you can, you will help other people. Because the point of this story was to increase medical screening of women, many of whom are strangled. Okay, that was one of the stories that just came jumping out of this piece, is how many women who are victims of domestic violence have been strangled and lost consciousness and lost oxygen, and that so much of this long-term deficit was about oxygen deprivation, brain damage, actually. So the point of the story was to, and this is where Jennifer's work came in, was to try to increase the amount of screening doctors do of women and ask them point blank about domestic violence. But to answer your question, trust was part of the process, because I could say, well, so-and-so who's in your, in your support group said you might be willing to talk to me. What are the things you feel comfortable telling me? What are the things you don't feel comfortable telling me? This thing that some previous people on the panel said, you give control to people. And that's real. I also didn't use their names, even though some of them wanted to use their names, and that was an issue with the lawyers for the magazine. So several of the people were actually willing to use their names. But I think the trust is really about being a good listener and using the information to give them dignity. I think that's important too. And a sense of power.
Cool. Jackie and Leila, how did you manage the friend thing in particular? I mean, you're entering the life of someone who's got a traumatic brain injury, a family that's lost so much. And you're spending a lot of time. There are personal relationships that build up. How did you handle that?
I mean, I think you just try to be as professional as possible without not being human at the same time. A lot of times, sometimes I was there without like my notebook out if we weren't having a conversation. But a lot of times, I had a notebook and a pen out, which in a sense conveys the relationship. And so, I wasn't going out, or if we were stopping someplace, I wasn't like buying him lunch or this or that type of thing.
But where it comes out a lot, I find, when I speak to reporters, is after the story is published and people, you're still in a relationship with them, and they may come back expecting the degree of attention they were getting, or may simply say, you're my friend now.
Well,
how did that play out?
I mean, I hope this isn't wrong to say, but I do consider Arturo and his family a friend to a certain extent. I mean, they're not the people I go to a movie with or dinner with on a regular basis, but I had dinner with Arturo and his new wife and the boys about 2 months ago. I meet his sister every few months for dinner. I think it's kind of harsh, or it's weird to me to think that, you spend so much time with someone and then completely drop them. So although there were clear lines during the reporting process, it's okay to stay in touch, I think.
Ben, teenagers, on the one hand, they may think you're invisible and that you're just not their friend because you're not there, or they can decide you're your friend immediately. How did you manage the ethical thing there?
We had a lot of questions that we asked right away about how we were going to handle, minors doing things and talking to us about things that were illegal. And I feel like at every step along the way, we sort of encountered each different conundrum we tried to bring the full force of our decision-making ability to each one of the forks in the road. Like, for example, when we wanted to do something about where are the guns coming from, like just how are these guns getting into the neighborhood, and Linda went and talked to a group of boys, and they were just, she said, we won't use your names. And so they speak really freely about just how easy it is to get a gun, where you get a gun, the dynamics of getting a gun, and she, in terms of that piece of it, one of the things that we did, even though they were anonymous, is, we talked to their parents, it had the permission of all their parents, obviously, but then we also played it for those kids in the presence of some of their friends, and they were saying, oh, I hear you here, I hear you here, I hear you here, and so we wanted to make the kids aware, like, look, you're going to be anonymous, but, when this is going to go out on the radio, and people, especially in your high school, are going to recognize your voice, and they're going to know who you are, so, we just want you to think about that and express feelings to us about that before we commit to this. And I feel like, there were a lot of different sort of intersections that we ended up at that we had to navigate.
I have one last thing for all of you, and then we'll call it an evening and have another glass of wine. These are all three of these projects are really challenging. They involve immersing yourselves in, for a long time, in dark, challenging material. What'd you do to take care of yourselves over the course of these projects, if anything? Anyone?
Well, I think Jackie and I talked a lot with each other. We spent a lot of time together during the project, and just sitting in a car waiting for Arturo to show up somewhere because he was always late. And we just talked with each other. Anything we were feeling or thinking about, we could kind of bounce off each other, and I think that was a really comforting thing for me.
Me too.
Jackie?
Oh, I mean, I was going to say the same thing. We spent so much time in the car together, so it was helpful to have, my second part to bounce things off of. And, I think there were times both when we left, we tried not to get upset in front of Arturo or his sons, because I didn't want particularly his sons to associate us every time with, like, the killings, which it may have already been that way anyway. But there were definitely many times where we'd leave and I'd be on my way home and would tear up thinking about everything. But
I think it might have helped a little bit that in your deciding the rhythm of the story, you couldn't avoid the low spots that were hurtful, but you also selected what you thought would be high spots, whether it was an achievement in terms of physical therapy, his eyesight was returning, a joyous family reunion. I think you found a certain cadence or rhythm in the reporting that not only reflected in the story, but it also gave you kind of a personal sense of something upbeat going on.
Yeah,
so you weren't 24/7 in the
right.
basement.
We definitely had times where we were just laughing with Arturo, or chatting.
Alexis, anything for you?
Well, again, I didn't have, I have had experiences where I was living the story or having a live-in story. This was different. I think actually the conversations themselves provided some of the solace that some of these women hadn't told their stories to anyone before. Some of them had. But there was a level of intimacy. I think journalists talk about this, right? We often feel like leeches, but maybe for good reason. Particularly in moments. What's that?
Pick your fauna. Yeah.
Pick your fauna, right. There were moments, and I was a daily reporter for a New York City paper, New York Newsday, for many years, and I was often sent to the scene of a crime where people were dealing with tremendous loss. And there was, it was sort of the emotional equivalent of cocaine. People were at their absolute best. People would say amazing things to you because they needed someone to talk to. And there was an incredible, pure, emotional high from talking to those people. This was different. This was people who had sort of sifted through some of their emotions, not sifted through some of the others, found an interesting listener, and I was giving them back some information which could help explain. So I actually think and I was doing it over the phone, which is really very different from what you guys are talking about. Really bad phone in Vermont that wasn't working at a time when my hearing wasn't great. So I actually think the story gave back to me from itself what I needed, which was a sense of connecting with people in a fairly intimate way and not providing an answer to them that would cure their symptoms, but, as I said maybe too many times, helping them figure out what was going on.
Yep.
Speculatively, but in some way, because they were feeling really alone with it, and I think they felt less alone.
Cool. Ben, would you do anything to take care of yourself on this?
I think that we definitely experienced sort of the thing of it being shared by everybody who is working on it. And then I also think that, like, just in terms of the difficulty of the subject matter, that the people who were actually in the school witnessing their, like, resilience really sort of put, at least for us, just as reporters, put a lot of perspective on just our distance from it. And then I would also say that in terms of our story, I think that it was also part of the complexity of it, and part of the, I guess, like the light or the buoyancy that kept sort of people's, everyone sort of spiritually afloat in the process of putting the things together was just that, for the most part, it wasn't like the realms of people's lives that we were accessing weren't those realms. I mean, at one point I was there for Terrence Green's birthday and I'm standing out on the street with 30 gang members at like 9:30 p.m. and it was so far from any sort of menacing. It was like everybody was having a good time. People were funny. They were joking around. Like it was surprisingly not dark. And his best friend Boogie, who I interviewed, like I think this speaks to this. He I'm friends with him now on Instagram. We follow each other, and one picture will be like it'll be like what he's eating for dinner, and then like the next one will be like his kid, and then 1 out of 15 will be him standing there with 2 guys who have handguns and he has a shotgun. But it's like the vast bulk of the way that when I was interacting with Boogie, like all Boogie wanted to do with me was joke around and tell me stories and hang out. And he was, one of the most polite 20-year-olds I think I've ever met. So yeah.
Okay, well, listen, again, let's have a round of applause for the extraordinary Alexis and Tom and extraordinary journalism. You guys are you are DART Award winners because you are all innovators. You are telling stories of stuff that is not traditionally the subject of journalism, of people that is not traditionally the subject of journalism, in ways that are not traditionally the techniques of journalism, and you now have thrown it into the hopper of journalism, and people are going to steal mercilessly from you, and in turn produce their own innovative work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.